I feel like the term indie darling fits Superhot well. Team Superhot's mesmerizing and mysterious puzzle shooter exploded onto the internet in 2016, capturing the attention of internet personalities and patrons alike. After starting out as a prototype in the 7-day FPS challenge, a week-long game jam for indie shooters, the full game was eventually crowdfunded and moved through the Steam Greenlight program. In a short matter of time, a separate virtual reality game, aptly titled Superhot VR, was released. Superhot's unique gameplay hook, meta-narrative, and minimalistic charm cemented it, to utilize another oft-used phrase, as an instant classic. This attention contrasted well with Superhot's plot of deep web manipulation and covert operations, with the phrase "Superhot is the most innovative shooter I've played in years" becoming almost as ingrained as the infamous and certainly less ironic "the cake is a lie." If you haven't played the original game, I would highly suggest that you do, not only to avoid any possible spoilers in my video, but just because it's a great title. It totally deserves all the praise it gets, so go in blind and don't let this video spoil you on the wild ride of the original. Throughout the course of the original Superhot, the titular program seems to become more and more insidious. Superhot.exe is just a weird game your friend sent you at first, until it becomes more and more apparent that something is using the program not just to watch you, but to communicate with you, with all the clandestine early internet spookiness of a barely sociable video. As you continue plowing through each level and every red figure in your way, the system, as the game refers to itself, brings you to a digitized version of your own home to knock out a digitized version of your own self. I see this as allowing the system to take further control of you. This manipulation reaches its conclusion with the final level involving the player uploading themselves into the system's hive mind. Superhot's story is intense and frenetic, which is also something that can ironically be said about the game's main gimmick. If you don't already know, in Superhot, time moves only when you do. Well, time actually moves really slow, which, as the developers say on their website, is a result of the constant movement of your body's internal operations. Now that's fun to think about. Superhot's drop in speed shifts the typical frantic action of a first-person shooter into the territory of a free-flowing strategy game. Each level is a puzzle that the player slowly unravels and rips apart, until they've gracefully torn their way through an army of faceless red enemies. Every piece of Superhot feels intentional. Every enemy, every weapon, and every environmental obstacle is placed specifically to increase the player's state of flow. Team Superhot seemingly left no room for improvement. Superhot Mind Control Delete is an early access expansion that improves the gameplay of Superhot in almost all aspects. Released in 2017, Mind Control Delete, or MCD, is a significant step up from the original in so many ways. Let's start by discussing the aspect of the game that was improved upon the least, the story. It would be irresponsible for me to compare the story of the full game to the story of a beta that is constantly being updated and added to, but MCD is packed full of enough changes for it to feel like a full standalone game, and because of that, the involvement in the story felt underwhelming, to no fault of the developers. I had to remind myself while playing and recording footage that MCD was a work in progress, an unfinished game, which allowed me to realize how awesome the work and passion put into this game and the series as a whole really is. Mind Control Delete takes place within the hive mind, as you take control of multiple different assimilated minds to clean up corrupted files and bugs within the system. This is a really interesting perspective for a continuation of the original game, as now you are literally playing as the singularity that assimilated the player character before. And in a way, you're still in control of the same character, but in a completely different state of being. Now, I know my previous claim of Mind Control Delete improving completely upon its base game is a big and possibly hot take, but I stand by it. First, let's talk about structure. The original Superhot was based around specific levels which usually had very specific problems with very specific answers. Maybe in later levels there were a multitude of these specific answers, but the game still had a linear nature, even in the open levels. MCD works a lot more like the endless stages unlocked after beating the main levels of the original game, but with a twist. Mind Control Delete introduces procedural generation and roguelike elements to Superhot. Each playable node gives players a series of challenges to play through, with variable amounts of challenges per node. These challenges pull from a pool of levels, and then the enemy types, certain obstacles, and available weapons are all randomly generated. This is where the replay value skyrockets. As a player, you begin to learn each level, and as you become more and more familiar with the layout of each one, you start to recognize locations where enemies spawn, and where certain items or weapons always are. The absolute versatility of each and every one of the stages in MCD is not just a testament to the level design chops of Team Superhot, but also to the procedural systems that go hand in hand with it. At certain pre-decided points in each node, the player gets the opportunity to choose between 2 upgrades, or hacks to use the game's terminology. These hacks are a lot of fun to play around with and allow for such a dynamic range of playstyles. Some are simple, such as healing or giving you an extra hit point. Oh yeah, hit points have been added to the game now as well, as they're kind of necessary with the new micro-roguelike structure. Other hacks include increased speed or throwing power, as well as some abilities that are totally bonkers. Some of my favorites include Grenade, which makes any throwable item explode with bullets on impact, as well as Shot Flow, which causes any headshot to zoom to the next nearest enemy. Katanas no longer slice bullets in half Goemon style, but rather direct them back towards the shooter. And this can be upgraded as well with the Deflect All hack, which returns every bullet in the air back to their original point of fire. As in most roguelikes, these upgrades are also completely randomized, leading towards a more frantic and improvised way of playing. This increased amount of chaos is only magnified by the new enemy behaviors and types. Let's look at the behavior of melee enemies first. In the original game, melee enemies were fodder or used in specific situations in which the player was disarmed, such as the prison fight stage. But in MCD, melee enemies act a lot smarter. The most obvious example of this is the way they deflect bullets, a technique that they do almost every time you shoot at them. This leads players to approach these opponents in different and unique ways. Shooting at their legs works sometimes, but not always. The player could also wait to shoot right as they swing or immediately after they block an initial bullet, which is a better application for the assault rifle than anything the original Superhot had to offer with it. This dynamic keeps players thinking on the move, keeps them from approaching every enemy in the same way, too. Another new enemy type that definitely changes how players attack are these guys, who I like to call armor guys. These enemies can only be shot in specific red body parts, and this gets especially hard when the body part in question is an extremity such as an arm or leg, as then you have to aim at a more mobile target as opposed to the relatively stable torso or head. Some opponents sport these red weapons. Most enemies will drop their gun when hit by a thrown projectile or melee weapon, but not these guys. Their weapons can't be removed, which forces the player to think a little more about their playstyle, especially when all different types of enemies are mixed together. There are also enemies that, when shot, explode and send bullets flying. These opponents not only encourage players to keep their distance, but also allow for players to chain kills and destroy close groups of enemies with a lot of style. The final new type of enemy is the dog, and I'm kinda conflicted on his role in the mix. The dog is scary at first, legitimately scary. He's reminiscent of Resident Evil 2 Remake's Mr. X, as an unstoppable force that outclasses the other enemies in almost every way. The dog's main ability is a dash that can propel him across a map almost instantly. A combatant that can move at this rate is incredibly intimidating in the slow-mo, bullet-time firefights of Superhot. It almost feels as though an ability that you've always had access to is being counteracted by a combatant with an eerily similar, yet stronger power. And it breaks the sense of security found in Superhot's main gimmick. That is, until you realize you can just avoid him. The dog can't be killed or hurt by any attacks available to the player, and can only be stunned at the cost of a lot of bullets. In this way, he's similar to Mr. X as well, intimidating and tough at first, but ultimately easy to circumvent after familiarizing yourself with his patterns and behaviors. That doesn't completely neuter him. During frantic firefights, the dog's intimidating speed can put a lot of pressure on the player, especially if he's allowed to close the distance. Large numbers of enemies that divide your attention synergize with the dog as well, as the player can often find themselves in trouble if they neglect one or the other. With all these new obstacles, it only makes sense that the player is also given more options to approach combat with. The previously mentioned upgrade system allows each run to have a little more randomness involved, while also giving players a sense of progression on a level-to-level scale. One of my favorite upgrades allows players to shoot again immediately after hitting an opponent. Another one allows players to shoot through enemies and possibly hit opponents behind them. The player also slowly unlocks different classes, or minds, with different abilities throughout the game. The first mind unlocked, Endurance, simply gives players an extra total hit point. But the two most interesting minds are Katana and Hot Switch. Hot Switch, which gives players the ability to switch places with an opponent, is already implemented in the original game. Katana, however, gives players the completely new ability to recall a thrown katana. In addition to starting every level with a katana, the ability to summon the sword back to your hands and potentially have it slice through any enemies in between makes this specific mind really fun to play around with. I was putting myself in bad situations just to see how many enemies I could line up to be sliced with the called back katana. Thematically, these minds are all people who have been assimilated into the system. My assumption is that Hot Switch is the mind of the original player from Superhot, as they had the same ability by the time they were brought into the hive mind. Different memory files unlocked throughout the game tell the player a little bit about each mind and the thoughts they were having before joining the system. For example, the katana mind belonged to some kind of Superhot fanatic who saw it as a way to train in cutting down the people she viewed as obstacles and problems. One of the memory files you get to see is the dogs, and while it's certainly not groundbreaking writing, it's still fascinating to get a glimpse into whatever this menacing figure was before it was absorbed into the system's collective consciousness. Mind Control Delete also gives the player a few more weapons to utilize in combat. Even the range of throwable items in the environment has increased, especially with the addition of throwable discs. These discs, which could be as small as a CD or as large as a manhole cover, work pretty similar to the shuriken weapon already present in the base Superhot game, with the only difference being that discs have to hit the opponents in the head to shatter them. The same idea applies to nails, screwdrivers, darts, etc., except they travel with a different arc than the disc weapons do. Big knives have also been added and are thrown in a similar fashion to katanas. What makes the knives fun is how you can grab them from an enemy almost immediately after it hits them, allowing you to chain a bunch of knife throws together in rapid succession. The guns have been tweaked in different ways as well. The shotgun spread seems to have been both slowed and narrowed in comparison to the original game, and the assault rifle now fires in 3-round bursts with one click as opposed to requiring 3 successive presses of the firing button. The biggest addition in the realm of weapons is probably the sniper rifle. This behemoth fires a large round almost instantly, which almost completely negates the need to lead a shot to hit a moving target. You point, and the bullet is there. Of course, the balancer to this kind of firepower comes from slow reload times in between powerful shots. However, the previously mentioned upgrade that reloads your gun immediately after hitting an opponent in combination ends up disrupting that balance, if the player is lucky enough to get both on the same run. Stages across each run are randomized, and not just which stages you play in what order, but aspects of the level itself as well. Sometimes there are walls that are placed to increase the tightness of firefights, and later on in the game there are trip mines randomly placed that explode with bullets if hit, or if the player walks across them. This forces the player to keep an eye on their surroundings, but also allows them to use trip mines to their advantage in destroying opponents. Your starting point in a stage is also randomized, and while this seems like a small detail, I went through most of the game believing that one level was actually 2 because of where I started being so different. It's not really a huge difference in compact stages, but the bigger spread out ones can play very differently depending on where you begin. Thematically, most stages stand out. A lot of areas in the original Superhot felt like generic hallways and office spaces, but MCD brings in a lot of charm with its battlegrounds. Some of my favorites are Dojo, which has a lot of fun melee weapons to play around with, Club, just because you can throw the DJ's records at enemies, and Yakuza, because of the way the game plays around with the placement of random walls in this relatively open space. At a certain point, you gain the ability to play each level in an endless mode, which can get really crazy. It can also get really laggy, as the endless amounts of enemies leave endless amounts of weapons and objects to be rendered, and I don't have endless amounts of RAM. And remember, all of these new introductions are part of a beta for this expansion to Superhot. Mind Control Delete isn't even finished, and yet it still feels like a full game. There's enough of a progression and enough variance and enough gameplay present for that to be so. MCD really does take the basis of Superhot and runs with it, not vis-a-vis any sort of revolutionary restructuring of the game's core, but by a large number of small tweaks, improvements, and additions, the most impressive of which being the roguelike level structure, which adds such a layer of replayability. The way this game forces you to think on your toes and adapt to different situations is so addictive. I kept coming back to Mind Control Delete in the same exact way I wanted to keep revisiting Superhot. The craziest thing to me is the fact that MCD is an expansion for Superhot. If you've been waiting for Superhot 2, it's kind of already out there. If you own the original Superhot, Mind Control Delete will eventually be a free update once it's finished, but if you're like me and you don't mind supporting a quality product, you can buy it now and play alongside development. I highly suggest that you do, even if it is just to support Team Superhot. And if all of this footage looks really cool to you and you haven't checked out the original, I highly suggest that you do that as well. Regardless of how much the hive mind wants me to say it, I really do believe that Superhot is the most innovative shooter I've played in years.